Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. Welcome back to Mosin Markings. Today we're taking a look at another really interesting marking. This is the infamous Tula Star. Now this isn't a particularly rare marking. It's not necessarily quite as common as the other marking we took a look at, which is the Ijevsk triangle. But this is still a pretty typical marking that you'll see on many Mosins. And it's one I definitely wanted to talk about. So let me zoom in here and we can get a better look at this rascal. Now, a lot of times you'll see a Mosin like this that has on the barrel marking this really big 5-pointed star. And within the star, there's going to be a vertical arrow pointed upward, okay? Now, you're going to sense a trend here already, and we haven't even started looking at many markings yet. When it comes to Mosin markings, there are going to be some common themes that you're going to see. And one of the really common themes is going to be an arrow somewhere. Whether it be in a triangle, in a star, by itself, in a bow and an arrow, you're going to see arrows. There's just something with Mosins and arrows. But today, of course, is no different. This infamous Tula Star is, of course, the factory logo for the Tula factory. Now, a little bit of background on this particular marking. Again, this is not a particularly rare marking. I would say the rarity of this marking is about let's just say a 2.5 out of 10 rarity. So not very rare. Now, there are a couple of different varieties of this, which we'll look at here. But again, if you come across this, you probably haven't hit the lottery just from this marking alone. But it is really cool, and it's a little bit less common than the Ijevsk marking that we took a look at. Now, the Tula factory, just a little bit of background on the factory itself, was actually founded by none other than someone you've probably heard of, regardless of what country you're from, a man named Peter the Great. Now, Peter the Great was kind of a big deal, and one of the important things he did among many of the important reforms throughout the Russian Empire was in 1712, particularly on February 15th, 1712, he said, we need to found a factory in the city of Tula. Now, this is a little bit of a different story. In fact, kind of the opposite scenario we saw with the Ijevsk factory, where the Ijevsk factory was a city really that came up around an existing factory. The factory was there basically first. Whereas the Tula factory was built in an existing city, which is kind of more the norm, you would think, right? Now, the city of Tula is pretty interesting. It's about 180 kilometers south of Moscow, a much more convenient location than that old pesky Ijevsk factory, which is all the way across the Urals in the middle of nowhere. But the Tula factory is pretty cool. It's on the banks of the Upa River. And again, it was founded in 1712, so quite an old factory. I mean, here in America, we look at the Ijevsk factory, which is now over 200 years old, and we say, that's a pretty old factory, 200 years old, because there's not a lot of stuff in America that's even 200 years old. But the Tula factory is even older. This is actually the original weapons factory in Russia. This was the also first state-owned weapons factory in Russia. So this factory, the Tula factory, is kind of a big deal. They would go on to, of course, produce a lot of rifles and weapons and pistols that would help defeat Napoleon around 1812. And they do a lot more than that. Now, see, here we can see this is a Mosin Nagant produced in 1929. Now, this logo isn't the logo that we're necessarily used to seeing if we look at Tula firearms from a historical perspective, because before 1928, Tula used a different logo, a different marking, and we're going to look at that marking another day, which has a lot of cool history behind it. But this marking, which we're looking at today, the star, is actually, compared to how old the factory is, this is a relatively new marking. This logo, this star with an arrow in it, and you can see the arrow if I zoom in a little bit. On the barrel shank, you will typically see some quills on the arrow here. We can see this guy has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the right side, and probably 5 on the left side, although you can't see them all. I'm not exactly sure if that's because they're worn off or they weren't properly or perfectly struck. Usually it'll be the case where the marking isn't always perfectly struck, which kind of makes sense because this is a curved surface, this barrel shank is. So still, despite that, pretty nice marking. But starting around 1928, you would see this marking. And it's funny because we had the same story when we were looking at the Ijev's factory. They changed markings as well in 1928. And if you also need help remembering 1928, it's also easy to remember because that was the year that Joseph Stalin basically collectivized all the farms, enslaving like 100 million people, which is a fun story for another day. But anyway, that was in 1928 that the factories changed the logo. And this would be the logo you would see throughout the rest of the Mosin production for the Tula factory. Now, one interesting caveat here that you might have already noticed about this rifle. Now, most Tula Stars are going to be on Mosin Nagant 9130 rifles if we're talking about Mosin Nagant variants, the later 9130 pattern. This, you may have noticed, is actually not a 9130. This is, in fact, a Dragoon rifle. And we can tell that because we have this older style Konovalov rear sight on it right here. Now, it's worth noting because it's not super common, but you can sometimes find Dragoon rifles like this one, where in that time period between 1928 and around 1931-ish, you can actually find Dragoon rifles with the old style rear sight like this one, but with the newer Tula Star logo, same with the Ijev's factory as well. So just an interesting note. And you can also find this marking on some of the parts, and we'll take a look at that here as well. But again, the Tula factory, at this time, they were producing roughly the same number of rifles as the Ijev's factory was throughout the 1930s and up until 1940. Now, that was an interesting year, of course, because in 1940, the Tula factory actually stopped production of these 9130 rifles, actually just Mosin Nagants altogether. That was really all they were producing up to that point, however. But regardless, they decided to scrap that in favor of production for the SVT-40 Tokarev semi-automatic rifle, chambered in the same caliber as this guy, which is pretty cool. So after that, as we all know, the Ijev's factory was the only factory producing rifles. Then, of course, we have Operation Barbarossa in 1941. And then this factory, the Tula factory, basically they packed up the entire factory upon orders of Stalin himself and shipped the entire factory with all of the workers all the way across the Ural Mountains to set up shop near the already existing Ijev's factory. What a mess. And somehow they managed to actually do it. It worked. And they were able to keep on producing rifles, although at a somewhat limited capacity. But still, the fact that they were able to produce any rifles at all during the war, given they had to basically move the factory, was pretty impressive. So that was pretty amazing. That's one of the cool and big triumphs of the Tula factory. It wasn't actually overrun, though, by the Nazis, and they are still around today, thankfully. So this is actually a pretty large testament to the tenacity of the Russian people and the factories in general. The Tula factory's been through a lot in the last 300 years, folks. Now, another thing you may have seen before is maybe this. We've shot this here on the channel a lot. This is Tula Ammunition. And you might ask, well, Big Sam, is that the same thing as the Tula Mosins? Is the Tula Ammunition? Is it the same factory? And the answer is not exactly. So the Tula Ammunition plant actually opened up around 1880. It was commissioned by Tsar Alexander II. But it was actually built in the same city, in the city of Tula. So it's kind of the same location as the factory producing this rifle. Although today this is a different facility altogether. It's known as the Ulyanovsk Cartridge Works. But Tula, again, has a really rich history, of firearms and ammunition manufacturing. In fact, by World War I, the Tula Ammunition factory, different from the Tula Mosin factory, helped produce around a quarter of all the ammunition used by the Russians in World War I. That's pretty amazing. So the city of Tula, if you're interested in firearms history, you got to go visit the city of Tula one day. It's a pretty important place. Now, that being said, let's talk about this marking a little bit more. Remember I said there's a couple variants you can find of this marking, okay? Now, first of all, you can actually find this marking in a different place sometimes. Now, this won't always be the case because it's on the wood, and a lot of times it can be worn off. But let me turn this rifle around here so I can show you guys something cool. All right, see right here? That's right, they put the same stamp with the year, and notice it's the same font, which is pretty cool, on the stock. Now, a lot of times you won't see this because either the stock was a replacement, or it wasn't built by the Tula factory, or it was built by the Tula factory, but let's face it, this is a cartouche, and Mosins have seen a lot of use, more than, honestly, most military surplus rifles out there. A lot of times this marking is just gone, okay? So it's pretty uncommon to see a marking here. Now, when you do see a marking like this, usually what that's going to indicate is your rifle is from the Spanish Civil War, and this will be dated 1936 or 1937, usually. Now, in this case, this is not a Spanish Civil War rifle. This is actually a Finnish Dragoon rifle. And since this is a later one, this was probably captured during the Winter War or the Continuation War. Again, not a super common rifle to see, but very interesting nonetheless. Well, let's take a look at another variant of this marking, though. Okay, since we're already here, and hopefully I don't trip over the tripod and make y'all sick and then, break one of my fingers. That would be bad. Let me scoot this guy all the way over here. Alrighty. And then I'm going to zoom in here on the butt plate. All right. Now, what's really fabulous, and you could kind of already tell from that cartouche, this is actually the original matching stock to the rifle, which you don't always see with Mosins. That's pretty cool. This is the original butt plate here with the original font matching the barrel. But also, you see this little 5-pointed star right there? It's a little tiny star, and you're not going to see anything within the star, but you are going to see a 5-pointed star. Guess what? That's also a marking of the Tula factory. So this is their small marking, and the other marking that we just looked at with the arrow, the vertical arrow pointed upwards, that's their bigger marking. And again, just like we stated earlier, you'll only see the small 5-pointed star during or after 1928. Before 1928, you're going to see the older marking, which again, we're going to take a look at another day. So hopefully y'all enjoyed the video and you learned a little bit about the Tula factory and some more really neat Mosin markings. I know I could talk about Mosin markings all day, and that's why we have to break out these videos into series, folks, because ultimately having 100 or 200 videos that are 5 or 10 minutes long is a lot better than having one video that's about 3 months long. So thank you guys for watching. If you like more Mosin Nagant content like this, and you're interested in learning more about cool Mosin markings, please go ahead and subscribe and hit that bell down below so you don't miss an episode. Let me know if y'all have any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.